Now coming to Green Revolution. Now why I am suggesting all these things or mentioning all these things is because unless you see this picture or try to fit in all these arguments, you will never be able to understand as to what happened in the case of Indian Green Revolution. You know, all of you know that India's Green Revolution, or let's say India's independence, came in the backdrop of the Bengal famine. This is a place which is historic in many ways. So let's go back to the era of Bengal famine. Amartya Sen tells us that in Bengal famine in 1943, production did not fall. Production was less in 1941, but there was no famine. Famine occurred in 1943 because food was diverted. Food was diverted, the private trade had cornered that, millions died. That is what, and of course, we all know Kalahandi was the first shipment to Bengal came from Kalahandi, which is now, of course, a starvation belt of India. Now, these are some stark realities that we need to understand. But in that backdrop, India got its independence. We were importing food under PL 480, as we all know. Not that Jawaharlal Nehru didn't try his best. In fact, I remember in one of his August 15 speeches, 1955, from the ramparts of the Red Fort, he had said, and we quote half the sentence, but we don't quote full sentence. The full sentence was, "It is very humiliating for any country to import food." You must listen to this. You have heard the second part again and again. So everything else can wait, but not agriculture. Now we use only the second part of the sentence. We normal, Finance Minister Chidambaram used to say, everything else can wait, but not agriculture. He didn't quote the first part. The first part is linked to it. He said, it is very humiliating for any country to import food. So everything else can wait, but not agriculture. Jawaharlal Nehru tried his best. All the community programs and so on and so forth, but somehow it didn't happen. In 1965, when Lal Bahadur Shastri was our Prime Minister, we had the war with Pakistan, but we also had a drought in 1965. And Bengal that year actually had, I would call it a famine, in which about 2,000 plus people died in 1965 in Bengal. But nevertheless, in 1965, we had a drought, a severe drought, in which we imported about 10 million tons of food grains. Lal Bahadur Shastri died in January 1966. Mrs. Gandhi took over. Mrs. Gandhi again faced a drought year. 1966 was also a drought year. In that particular year, we imported 11 million tons of food grains under PL 480. This was the biggest food import at that time in history. And then came the era when, that was 1966, was also a time when Borlaug had developed his miracle wheat seeds and was trying to push wheat into India. And he was very sure that India is the right place for it. There was a debate in India at that time. Some scientists supported him, some didn't, and so on and so forth. But I remember asking Borlaug once, I said, how did you manage to click in India? He said, one of the approaches he followed was, he knew the rivalry between Pakistan and India. So he would play one against the other. So he went to Pakistan and said, if you don't take wheat seed, I'm going to give it to India. To India, I said, if you don't take wheat seed, I'm going to give it to Pakistan. So they both were in the race. So now what happens is, Mrs. Gandhi, as you all know, in October 1966, we got the first crop of, we sowed the first crop of the dwarf wheat seed that we got from Mexico. You will agree that Green Revolution, of course, is much written about, much talked about, and so on. But one of the things which always baffled me was that a program of the size of Green Revolution cannot happen unless there is a political will behind it. Now, what was that political will? So I asked once Dr. Swaminathan as to what was that political will that actually pushed in Green Revolution into India. It can't be just Borlaug wanted to sell his seats and you were keen to take on his seat. There must be political backing for it. And Swaminathan gave me a story which I don't know whether he narrates it or not, but his story was very fascinating. He said actually the entire history of Green Revolution, if you were to dub it, it would be written in a car journey. He was driving Mrs. Indira Gandhi when she was the Prime Minister. He was driving her to IARI, Indian Agriculture Research Institute, where he was the director, if you remember, and in that to inaugurate something. And he said in that car journey, Mrs. Gandhi asked him a question, and I am quoting him. He said, Mrs. Gandhi said, Swami, that's what she used to call him, Swami, would you give me a commitment? If I take this seed that you are trying to sell me, can you give me a surplus in a couple of years from now? Again, the second part of the sentence is very important. Mrs. Gandhi said, because I want the bloody Americans off my back. Remember what Nehru said, it is very humiliating for any country to import food. And that's what Mrs. Gandhi was actually facing. The arm twisting, all those hassles and the humiliation that she must have undergone. So she was willing to take that risk to ensure that we become 18,000 tons of wheat seed from America. Let me make it clear, it was not certified wheat seed. What came to us from Mexico, not America, but Mexico City Senate, actually was not certified wheat seed. It was cleaned grain from the farmers' fields. Farmers were asked, because 18,000 ton was a big requirement, and in a short time, so what India did was asking them to provide whatever grain they could provide, and that was clean. And what came to us was cleaned grain. It's not certified. It's another interesting development, or another interesting study that we must do about the certified seed industry that emerged later in India. And I have always been questioning, why do you need certified seed for wheat and rice when cleaned grain of wheat could bring in a revolution? Why do you need to certify seed and put the burden on the farmer? That is why most of the seed federations across the country have always been in red in this country, because they were not required. Nevertheless, we got the 18,000 tons of seed. And as Devinder said, prior to me, that seed they planned it out. In 5 kilos packets, it was distributed to the farmers in the areas demarcated. In those irrigated areas, they thought were the best equipped to do that. Punjab, Haryana were one state at that time. Part of eastern UP, part of western UP, maybe Bengal, some areas, and some in Andhra and so on. But by and large, this was the Green Revolution belt. Now, the first crop we got was a quantum jump. Normally, India's wheat production at that time was hovering around about 12 million tons. The first jump we got was 5 million tons, and that is why Mrs. Gandhi came up with the wheat revolution statement, and wheat revolution stamp was also issued. That was a time when India gradually stopped PL 480 imports. And the biggest objection when India stopped PL 488 was from the finance ministry. They never liked India stopping PL 480 imports, and that's what happens. There's a lobby in India which is very happy with export-import. That's where they make money. So they are always opposed to any import stopping. So anyway, the finance ministry had objected to it. Now, 10 years later down the line, after Green Revolution began, the negative impacts of Green Revolution began to be seen. What is subsequently called as the second generation environmental impacts. These became very prominent in those areas. But this is where the scientists forgot to going for what I call as midterm correction. Every time the finance minister presents a budget, 6 months down the line he presents midterm corrections. Now I thought the scientists should have also presented something called as midterm corrections. But they suggested to the farmers that whatever losses or whatever, the insect attack, more insect attack and more crop losses, they said you go in for more Green Revolution, which means more fertilizer, more pesticide. That's what was pumped in. So we have this problem exacerbating over the years, and of course now much of the suicide problem in this country is of course because of the credit equation going wrong, but that credit equation is going wrong because we have destroyed the natural resource base. Once you destroy the natural resource base, your cost of production has gone up phenomenally. Your output price is not keeping pace. This is also interesting. If you look at globally, in the last 20 years, how the input prices have gone up. But the output price, whether in America or whether in India, has remained static. Studies by UNTAD show that the output price or the farm gate price all over the world in the last 20 years has remained frozen. Except for, if you adjust for inflation, the prices are frozen. If today in Bengal, the tomato is still selling at 60 paisa or 80 paisa or 1 rupee, 20 years earlier also it was almost the same if you have adjusted for inflation. Now that is something, you will agree. If the output price remains static, the input price has been rising phenomenally, plus because of the destruction of the natural resource base, the input requirement has also gone up phenomenally. You require roughly double the amount of chemical fertilizers now to produce the same kind of crop that you were producing 10 years back. So that means your not only the quantity has gone up, your cost has gone up and so on, and that has added on to your burden, but the output price remains static. So the farmer has no choice but to commit suicide. If you and me, our income was to remain static for 20 years, I'm sure many of us would have committed suicide by now. So it is no exception that the farmers have committed suicide. And when we tell farmers that the best way to pull you out of this is that we go in for FDI in retail, we go in for contract farming, I can tell you we are bigger criminals than the poor farmers at whom we are trying to adjust to. That's very sad, very tragic that there's a lobby in India which works, as I said earlier, the scientists were working for the industry. There's a huge lobby of management consultants and then the economists who work only for the corporate sector. So they would have all the kinds of arguments that unless we bring in FDI in retail, the farmer in India would not gain. Now FDI in retail is a different story. I can come to that later. But first, let us look at where we are today. Why is the farmer suffering out of the green revolution? And then what do we need to really bail him out? Do we need to extend that green revolution model to Eastern India, or do we need to apply a different approach here? Now let's look at that. Punjab is the seat of green revolution. Punjab produces roughly 50% of the surplus that the country produces. As was said earlier, the water requirement has never been computed in that form. For every liter, every kilo of wheat grain, you actually require 1,000 liters of water on an average. But I think the requirement for wheat actually is 3,000 liters. But if you take an average for all cereals, it is 1,000 liters. For rice, the average for producing 1 kilo of rice is, according to IRI, it is 5,000 liters. But according to me, it is 3,000 liters in India, maybe 5,000 liters in America, but even 3,000 liters. But when you grow hybrid rice, the water requirement goes up. Now, isn't it ironical that in a country which has 65% or 60% area under dryland agriculture, in all the dryland regions of India, we actually are growing crops which require more water. Common sense tells us that in dryland areas, we should be growing crops which require less water. I'm sure you'll all agree. But here in this country, in the dryland regions, we not only grow hybrid rice, we grow hybrid sorghum, hybrid bajra, hybrid maize, hybrid cotton, hybrid vegetables. Now the requirement of water for hybrid crops is roughly 1.5 times that of the high-yielding varieties. In Punjab, where 99% area is under assured irrigation, we grow high-yielding varieties. But in Andhra Pradesh, we grow hybrid rice. In Bengal, of course, your water table is quite high, but now the thrust of the country is, or the Ministry of Agriculture is to go hybrid across crops, across country, across regions in India. And not requiring, on the one hand, we talk of the destruction of the soil, destruction of the natural resource base. The hybrid crop production is higher, productivity is higher because it requires more fertilizer, more pesticides, more water. But somehow we believe that the argument is that we have to meet the population growth in this country. Again, that's another area which has been used by the industry and the economists to again confuse us with this argument.